I woke up with anticipation and a little fear this morning. I was going to push myself to achieve things I've never done before. I would be attempting to hike 20+ miles in one day. I was going to try and brave what I knew would be a cold and wet night, and I would be doing it alone. I climbed out of bed without disturbing my wife or daughter. There was no need for a shower this morning. I ate a filling breakfast of apple pie, grabbed the gear I had packed so diligently the night before, and headed out to the van. Upon starting the vehicle, I realized the windshield was covered in a layer of ice. Not a great way to start the day, I thought to myself. I stopped at the nearest Starbucks for a peppermint mocha, my favorite drink, as well as a morale booster for such a cold morning. The drive to Henrico State Park was otherwise uneventful. The sunrise was pretty and there was little traffic to deal with at 7 in the morning. Driving up the long winding road to the headquarters, there were patches of field still covered in frost. Arriving at the headquarters, I paid the fees for backpacking and for my vehicle, filled my water bottles, and I was on the trail by 8 a.m. I was excited to get hiking. The pace for the day was set, and it was a quick pace. I'd been planning this trip for a couple of weeks and thought I had my gear dialed in precisely how I needed it to be. It was cool, so I was wearing my base layers and using my rain jacket as a wind barrier. Hiking in the sub-40-degree temperatures like that was easy and comfortable. I've heard it said before that people train in the Sierras for Henrico. Whether this is true or not, hiking at Co can be grueling. Over the course of the next 22 miles, I would gain and lose some 10,000 feet of elevation. There are no stretches more than a quarter mile of flat ground, and this makes it unappealing to a lot of people. I like it for that reason. I felt like I had the park all to myself. It was getting close to 10 a.m., and finding a reasonable spot near a stream, I took a break. I prepared second breakfast, oatmeal and coffee with some pure butter shortbread snacks. While I was eating my oatmeal, two fellows started walking my way. After exchanging pleasantries, we got talking about each other's routes and weather conditions. I hadn't had a chance to check the weather since the day before, and was curious about what to expect that day. The weather had been great thus far, and I was hoping that it would hold out. I was informed, however, to the contrary, and that I should expect rain around 2 p.m., and that it wasn't going to let up until sometime late in the night. We wished each other luck on our respective hikes and bid each other a farewell. I finished my coffee and shortbread and got back on the trail. Having covered about 5 miles already, and with 6 more till I reached what was my next planned break point, I plodded on. The terrain became more challenging, and most of it was along the spine of a high ridge. The temps were still below 40, and the wind didn't improve the conditions. To make things worse, the sky was looking more and more gray. Not more than a mile from my destination, Mississippi Lake, it began to sprinkle. It continued to sprinkle the rest of the day, never letting up and never getting more intense. At Mississippi Lake, I had to make a decision. Was I going to keep hiking towards my ultimate goal of Paradise Flat, camp at Mississippi Lake, or turn around and camp nearer to the park entrance? After a little debating, I started to head back. As I was heading back, the skies grew even darker. Realizing that it was from the sun setting, I began to look for a good spot to set up shelter for the night and go to bed. There was a lush spot I came across along the Willow Ridge Trail and set up for the night. I was going to be trying a number of new things. I was going to try new shelter, new sleeping quilt, new pad, ground cloth, and more. Once set up, I climbed in and noticed the shelter was far smaller than when I had set it up in the backyard. I tried to readjust the stakes and the pitch height, but to no avail, and the sun was gone. I curled up in my quilt and tried to make the best of it. Then I checked the time. 5:30 p.m. I was lying on my side, wearing wet clothes, lying on a wet sleeping pad, in the rain, and it was only 5:30. I was cold and miserable, and it made me miss my family all the more. Taking a whole 37 seconds to make the decision, I began packing. A very sloppy pack job. I put all the insulation into my waterproof bag except the down jacket which I was now wearing. I packed up all I could while in the shelter, then packed the shelter up last. I put on my headlamp and started running. I ran because I was cold. I ran because I wanted to be home, and I ran because I was afraid of the dark. I had already hiked 17 miles and was about to attempt speed records. I was running down a precarious single track through the woods covered in wet leaves. I crossed a river and began running along a fire road that would bring me back to the van. My headlamp flipped to my visor, and I prayed that it would not run out of battery before I got back. I did, however, keep a spare in my pocket. 20 minutes later, the light began to fade. It was foggy, and I was having trouble seeing through it, and the rain wasn't making it any better. I changed the battery. I did the math in my head quickly. I had covered 1.5 miles with one battery while running, and still had 4.5 miles to go with one battery. I didn't know how I was going to make it. With little more than a mile to the next campsites, I thought, maybe if I could get there, I'll hunker down in the large porta-potty till morning and then finish hiking out. Then the battery died. I put the old one back in the flashlight, and lo and behold, it was working like new. The batteries were quitting working when they got too cold. Keeping the spares in my pocket would warm it back up enough to get it to work well again. I kept hiking like this, changing the battery every 20 or 30 minutes and using my squeezed keychain light to help illuminate as well. My depth perception was horrible with just the one flashlight attached to my visor and felt like I had tunnel vision, but with the added squeeze light, it was just enough to light the path effectively and to help me see. I kept hiking, still coming across patches of fog so dense that I couldn't see more than 5 feet ahead of me, but the lights were holding out, and so were my legs. I would come to signs giving the distances to the headquarters and rejoice that the numbers were continuing to get smaller. The last sign said half a mile to HQ, and running out of energy, I changed the battery a last time and began counting my steps. 547 steps later, I was off the trail, onto the parking lot. I had survived. I had hiked 22 miles in a day. I was still wet and cold, my clothes cracked with each movement because they were frozen, but I was in a running, heated van. I changed into the spare dry clothes I had stashed earlier and called my wife. I'm on my way home. Some changes I would make to help achieve my goals of a successful solo overnight trip in wet weather with low temperatures in the 30s. 1. When expecting cold and wet conditions, bring synthetic insulation. It retains some warmth even when wet, whereas natural insulation like down doesn't. 2. I would bring a set of clothes to keep dry for the specific purpose of sleeping in. 3. I would keep as much stuff dry as possible, especially true of my sleeping pad. Not much point of having dry sleeping clothes if the thing you'll be sleeping on is wet. 4. Set up camp at the first sign of bad weather. It's much more pleasant to set up shelter while still dry than to wait until cold and wet. 5. If expecting foul weather or expecting to be in the shelter for extended periods of time, bring a big shelter, especially if I hope to dry my clothes while I'm there. Lastly, 6. Bring a book to read while in camp. It's heavier than not bringing one, but will give me something to do while I'm alone. Thank you for watching.